much, Minister. Please, let's take our seats. The current Chair, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Development of the Republic of Mauritius, and TDB Group Chairperson, Cabinet Secretary, National Treasury of the Republic of Kenya, Mr. Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry, Africa Union Commission, Ministers present and TDB shareholders and representatives, my good friend, Mr. Ademasu Tadese, TDB Group President and MD, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, guests and visitors, good morning. Let me first take this opportunity to, on behalf of the people of Kenya, to be grateful to TDB Group for the presentation of the $100,000 to Tome Water project in Laikipia. I can confirm that they deserve ability to successfully achieve development objectives in a dynamic and complex operating environment. At all times, sustainable development is expected to take place within a context characterized by increasingly devastating threats and weaknesses across all sectors. In our time, everyone interested in growing the economy by increasing wealth, creating jobs, eradicating poverty, and reducing inequality has to confront the fundamental challenge of an increasingly tight fiscal space and the emergence of rapidly mutating and highly complicated new threats. All these threats have been explained to us today in the morning, from what happened with COVID all the way to the very unlikely, or so it was thought, war in Europe, and all the other things in between, and especially the big threat of climate change. The cumulative burden of these challenges and threats can encumber economies to be so oppressive that pessimistic assessments of the prospects of growth become mainstream, and the idea that some regions of the world are not doing well at all begin to take root. It is true that post-colonial Africa struggled to develop because it had very limited resources to liberate its economy from institutions that were extractive by design, a low industrial capacity that ensured that raw materials were mainly exported, minimal economic diversity, and of course, the challenge of political instability. Efforts to acquire resources to break out of this vicious circle of underdevelopment and poverty only plunged many of our economies into an inescapable debt trap, which reduced the resources available to initiate progressive programs and policies, and at the same time made governments more vulnerable to natural as well as human threats across many sectors. The nomenclature of economic classification and development categories is quite telling, with least developed countries and heavily indebted poor countries becoming normalized methods of describing post-colonial Africa and other states of the global South. Recent high-profile events have demonstrated that the entire global economy is generally vulnerable to shocks and disruptions due to growing economic interdependence and globalization. At the same time, they also underscored that advanced economies have greater capacity to invest in measures to improve recovery from these events and resilience to future threats. These measures are often taken at the expense of more vulnerable counterparts, whose prospects invariably depend on closer cooperation on terms defined by such considerations as equity and justice. Volatility in global commodity prices has always exposed the vulnerability of many economies. Often, prices of raw materials exported from these economies collapse drastically, while at the same time, that of such essential imports as petroleum rises steeply. Every episode of such crisis sinks our economies deeper into difficulty, weakening currencies, raising interest rates, and increasing inflation. The most fundamental legacy of COVID-19 now stands as the manner in which it exposed global inequality and injustice. As movement was severely curtailed by the closure of borders and grounding of aviation services, global supply chains were constricted and inevitably we have taken a massive hit in terms of worsened fiscal imbalance and deeper debt, which has been worsened by the emergence of a high interest rate environment. The geopolitical tension that exploded into open conflict in Ukraine have also intensified this very difficult situation. But that is not the end of the matter for Africa. Our plate is stacked much higher with urgent and serious problems. Our continent is experiencing extreme weather events of unprecedented variety, frequency, and magnitude. Flooding, wildfires, landslides, droughts, cyclones, and other disasters have inflicted a dire toll on communities across our continent. The Sahel, West Africa, Central Africa, the Horn of Africa, East and Southern Africa have all been affected by these serious calamities. Human life, damage to property, and the destruction of infrastructure have not only worsened suffering for vulnerable people, but also dampened economic prospects. It has become inescapably clear that adverse climatic events are actively threatening our hard-won development gains, including advances in providing public services like health, education, security, and investment in national infrastructure like transport and communication networks. Reflection on these matters have also defined a critical weakness in the prevailing thinking in development and climate action, which treats the two imperatives as separate, unrelated undertakings. In the course of engaging the international community on these twin imperatives, African countries have found common ground in their unique shared perspectives as climate action frontline territories located at the intersection between environmental disasters, economic crisis, and development constraints. We recognize at once that the adverse impacts of climate change pose real and serious threats to all our achievements as well as prospects with regard to development, and that at the same time, financial capacity and therefore economic development is urgently needed to provide necessary resources to invest in effective climate action. Increasingly, we are having to make the difficult choice between economic growth and climate action, when, as a matter of fact, both courses of action must be pursued simultaneously because they are complementary. One will not happen without the other. On the basis of this realization, African countries have begun to approach multilateral engagement on climate change and economic development from a new perspective, anchored on a commitment to a green, climate-positive growth, and which profiles Africa as the green continent of the future, abounding with natural resources, investment opportunities, and human capital. What I'm trying to say here is that we have to reposition ourselves. We have to reposition our continent in the context of the situation, the challenges that face the globe, and we have to reposition ourselves in the context of the assets that we have. Renewable assets, being the continent with almost 65% of uncultivated arable land, being the continent that has the youngest human capital, and being the continent that has the greatest potential for greening growth and ensuring that we decarbonize industrialization, decarbonize manufacturing. And we have to reposition ourselves, represent Africa in a different way, away from the continent that was always profiled with all the negative adjectives. Climate change has brought some measure of equality, let me say. In the context of climate change, there is no developing or developed country. We are all in the same place. And being there in the same place positions us as a continent to take advantage of the assets that we have, the renewable assets that we have, the human capital that we have. In any case, by 2050, a quarter of the world's population will be living in our continent. And because of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, we've managed to assemble 1.4 billion people into one single market. And the place of DTB as a financial institution in that context, institutions that we are developing in our continent. And that is why last week, during the AU media meeting, we proposed that TDB, Afreximbank, AFC, ATI be now elevated from being partners of the AU to being special agencies of the Africa Union, so that we can give this institution greater recognition, we can give them better profiling to be able to support the trajectory we are all pushing of creating one market, without positioning ourselves in that space, because that's the only way we can get ahead of the situation that we are all in. The first implication of this paradigm naturally has been the now widely accepted view that the present architecture of the international economic development framework is deficient and inadequate for the challenges of our time. The Bretton Woods institution system of multilateral financial institution was explicitly designed for another purpose, at another place, and at another time, and is now fundamentally inadequate, unjust, and sometimes unfit for the demands of our complex, dynamic, and interdependent world. We must work with them in the context of how do we reform, how do we work with the international financial architecture to recreate it so that it becomes much more responsive in terms of scale of resources available, cost of resources available, and efficiency in how much time those resources are made available. I think there is a healthy, robust debate, and I expect African financial institutions like TDB to be front and center in that conversation so that they can give our perspective from our continent in that debate so that we are not negatively profiled all the time as a risky destination for investment or for development financing. And please, DDB, don't join the people who profile us as a risky place. You should be the ones to say Africa is the best place to invest and that we are not risky at all. In fact, this is a continent that has the highest return on investment, and everybody should be heading in this direction because in any case, we are the continent